Welcome to the Critical Media Studies Podcast. We're your hosts, Mike Rapici
and Barry Falk.
Good morning, Dr. Rapici. How are you today?
Dr. Falk, I am fantastic this morning. How are you, sir?
I'm doing very well. I'm eager, as always, to talk about the subject of the day, which is J. David. We're doing the OG stuff in this episode, or I guess we have been for a while, and maybe the whole episode, maybe our whole raison d'etre is OG stuff, like old school. Original gangster media theory. Maybe it is, possibly.
I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but as this just sounds funny for me to say, as OG as this episode may be, I got to tell you, it feels so incredibly contemporary. And so, yeah, I'm excited to go OG with you. This is just it. I'm amazed at how well this is.
Yeah, and then that's maybe the best way to introduce this episode. I mean, OG 19. We're talking about J. David Bolter's and Richard Grusin's co-authored media studies text published in 1999 called Remediation, and I mentioned the publication date. But I think, and we're in this episode, I think we're tasked. We set ourselves with the task of introducing some of their key terms. And at least in our appraisal, maybe we'll find out something different in our conversation. Maybe our conversation will pull us in a different direction. But in our pre-talk, Michael and I were very impressed by how a 1999 book that is very pointedly, very clearly describing, its descriptions of the real internet, right? How interactions with the internet look like in 1999. This shouldn't hold up, right? A book that's based on descriptions of the earliest manifestation of the World Wide Web, or one of the earliest manifestations. There have been this is, as we were remarking, kind of effectively pre-Amazon.com.
Well, I'll tell you,
let me just finish the point.
Yeah,
it didn't hold up, but I think we were saying it does.
To your point, though, one of the things that I appreciate about this, the text is full of pictures, and that sounds
right.
But what's amazing is in their discussion of I am jumping ahead here, and this is going to be very quick. But in their discussion, for example, of hypermediation, they're showing websites in the Netscape web browser. This isn't to me. This isn't a case of like, ooh, how old is it, and how far have we come? What struck me about it is that by any account at this point, the design and technology and layering that goes into all this, which are all things that we're going to discuss in a bit, is ancient, but it still works. It still plays. The discussion,
the structure is recognizable, right?
Not only recognizable, it feels native. It feels natural. And so it looks weird comparatively. It certainly is awkward and boxy as opposed to a lot of the slick and polish that we have now. But this entire discussion, and so I'm going to use this as an opportunity just to reach back for a second and talk about what we did last time with Kember and Zelinska about the idea of mediation, which is obviously the topic of the book here, about how old media build on new media. Excuse me, I had that backwards. How new media build on old media, and how this is evolutionary. You see that so clearly, that what is old is still recognizable. It's still a discussion. And this is one of those texts that is aged so well. And I think really the fact that it has, I mean, it's shocking to me that it's 25 years old.
Yeah.
But the fact that it is still something that we don't have to make excuses for. It's not as if you have to sit here and talk to this to maybe younger listeners and say, well, here's the thing. Back when this was published, this is what it looked like. This still works.
It's still a recognizable description of we recognize our landscape, even though there are differences on the map.
Right.
or differences in the new locale. We recognize this particular map of the internet, so we basically have a positive idea. Oh, you want to say
Yeah,
something?
no,
Yes.
just one thing. I think, and I guess all of this is to say
Hmm.
that if you look at this idea or
Hmm.
these ideas of mediation, remediation, hypermediation,
Hmm.
immediacy, all of the terms that we're going to play with today, this text is actually a proof in itself that these ideas, these theories work, because we have updated versions. We look at what we look at
Very
these
good.
these ideas and these examples, and you realize, yeah, these are older media. Uh, we look at the current versions of these things and we can see the connections very clearly. And it's not something distinct. It's not something different.
Mhm.
New is not new,
New
you
is
know.
not new, and that might be the one of the big takeaways from this book. Um, I'm
I'm
going to
gonna
lay a
stop. I'm
little.
gonna stop so
No,
we can get started.
well, I'm just going to lay a little bit more foundation, in particular, build a bridge or have one last look back at Kimber and Zelenska. And then we will move straightforwardly, directly into Bolter and Grusin's 1999 book, Remediation. But just a moment ago, Dr. Rapici, you did something very helpful that I think it should also sort of um, put this at the very beginning as a kind of initial move of this particular episode. You very casually, and I'm just going to return it to it and underscore it, but you very casually and expertly mentioned the four terms that we're going to be trying to elaborate on, define using Bolter and Grusin. So I'm just going to, for our listeners' benefit, I'm going to repeat what you just said, the four terms that you identified, because I think we'll be returning them to them, all of them, in different ways throughout this whole episode. So
Hmm.
they are mediation, mediation, and remediation. That's the big concept that we're talking about. You also use the term immediacy. We're going to discuss that. And also the notion of hypermediacy. So those are the four terms from Bolter and Grusin we're going to return to and elaborate from a couple different perspectives. And so I think we're ready to go to page 5 after I do one more thing. And Dr. Rapici is going to do the honors of reading this meaty passage at the beginning of Bolter and Grusin's introduction, which we're mainly going to be talking about in this episode. I think I can make a promise for the next episode being on. We're going to also, the next episode will be on the first chapter, I think,
Hmm.
of Bolter and Grusin. But now we're talking about the introduction and their four foundational terms. Um, one look back to our previous episodes on Kimber and Zelenska, their 2014 book. Um, um, we read and discussed a chapter. What was it? Media vitality in new media, something like this. But it basically was a chapter from Kimber and Zelenska from their 2014 book, Life After New Media. And remediation is marked, and that basically we're taking our cue from that text because according to Kimber and Zelenska, the notion of remediation to them is a kind of field changing um, term. And I think we would agree with that, that and what they found handy and helpful about the concept of remediation, they like it a lot. And they just feel that other writers in the time since, I mean, this is what they like about it. And then I'm also going to say what um, their criticism of the term is. And it's not really a criticism of the term. It's a criticism or a criticism really a devastating criticism of Bolter or Grusin. Their main criticism of the concept of remediation is that people don't take it seriously enough.
Right.
But what they like about the term, in general, they're incredibly positive about the term in that they feel that remediation offers a solution to a pressing problem that they see in media studies. What's the pressing problem? That media, to tell the history of media, to narrate that story, you are always talking about new evolutions of residual technologies. You just a moment ago when you were describing the internet and the map of the internet provided by this book, you use language that was a lot like Raymond Williams'
Right.
language, talking about history. Like there's always in the present moment, there's always the presence of something emerging, and there's also the strong presence of the residual.
Residual. Right.
So the present day is never, it's always a three-way layer cake, right? It's
Hmm.
always layer cake. It's always a hybrid of present, the truly present, the truly
The
the
dominant.
dominant, thank you, the dominant, but there's always a residual that's not dominant, but it's still present. And then there is an emergent that's not dominant yet. Um, so media studies, according to Kimber and Zelinska, always was grappling with the problem of how to talk about the emergent, because in technology, media technologies, the problem of the new is the constant problem. The problem of the emergent and the rapid acceleration of change. It is the problem of the field. And Kimber and Zelinska says, what the hell? People don't really know how to talk about it. So let me just speak about how they think remediation solves the problem. They think that it is a better resolution of the problem. That concept helps solve, it doesn't resolve the tension, but it is a better way of framing the emergence and thinking about the emergence of the new than simply saying, well, there's a new thing. It replaces the old thing, which they feel was kind of symptomatic of an old school media studies.
Well, I think there's another problem
Mhm.
that's wrapped up in this. And so I don't want to regurgitate everything that you've just said because I think it's all right. But the other problem is that
Mhm.
in academia, media studies has a problem that most other fields don't. And that is that it is tied directly to popular culture. It is
Oh,
subject
true.
to capitalism and marketing in a way that, say, literature isn't, right? And the bottom line is that
Literature is more residual. Let's keep on using the terms.
it is,
Yeah.
right? But so the problem
Right.
is that when you have uh the evolution of a technology, right? So this idea of remediation, their problem with it is not with the concept of remediation as Bolter and Grusin have it. Their problem is that the popular opinion seems to want to say new is better, new is different. And I feel that's a direct result of the capitalist need to sell the new, to gain traction for the new, to turn the wheels. Other fields in academia don't have this problem, right? But or at least not to the degree that something like this is going to have. But you introduce a new technology like the iPod, for example, to go back to the time of writing here.
Marketing affects media studies.
It
Absolutely.
it does, and so it has to be new in order to sell. And it's counterintuitive to say, well, that's yes, it's the next thing, but it's still rooted in something prior. That's not going to work. So
Mhm.
this idea is that I think you hit it on the head. Their problem isn't with remediation. Their problem is with the popular conception of what Williams calls the emergent, what marketing wants to call the new, right? That we have to look at this as tethered uh, to the dominant and the residual.
That is such a wonderful observation and very important observation because I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. Media studies, I mean, other fields experience this. There, of course, is the field of popular culture studies within the academy, right? Which
Absolutely.
also has to deal with and accommodate these pressures from the outside, so to speak.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right to say that's probably the root cause of Kimber and Zelinska's criticisms of those critics who
Yes.
use the term.
Yes. Our,
That's wonderfully well said. Thank you very much for that addendum.
our
And
our our friends in archaeology don't have this problem.
No.
No.
And I think you're also right to say that literary study, I mean, in a sense, no matter how hard we in English try, we can't
You-
erase the residual
You're
element
not
of
you're not
literary studies.
rebranding Jane Austen.
We are, but we're not.
But
We're,
well,
you
you
know,
try. It's and
we
it's
try.
there's that constant attempt to
We
connect.
try.
Yes,
Yeah,
but it's not going to be nearly as visible,
absolutely.
or you're not
Absolutely.
going to get the amount of
Absolutely.
traction that you will with something that
Absolutely.
is more, I don't know, shinier, more of an
Absolutely.
evolution. Shall we jump in?
Please.
Okay, so
Why don't you move on to so we're now going to dig into the text a little bit.
yeah, and I want to just say up front, I'm going to read this, but one of the things, and we can do this before or after, the terms remediation, immediacy, and hypermediacy
Mhm.
all make an appearance in this single paragraph. And so we're going to have to do, I think, a little bit of start stop to make sure that we're talking. Or do you
All
want to
right.
talk about it first?
No, I think I want to do
Okay.
stop start.
Okay. So here we go. This is on page 5 of the introduction. And they say, in this last decade of the 20th century, we are in an unusual position to appreciate remediation because of the rapid development of new digital media and the nearly as rapid response by traditional media.
Okay, so let's stop right there just to offer the briefest explanation of the term remediation. Okay, so
Well,
it's going to get more complex. Oh, do you want to?
yeah, no, I was going to say, I think that it's best to sort of, we talked about Ken Burns-Zelinski in a previous episode. And if you haven't listened to that episode, we enjoyed it. We hope you enjoy it. You should go back and listen to it. Um, there's a series of terms here, and I
Okay,
want to go back into Ken Burns-Zelinski real quick just to talk about mediation, because
please,
the idea
please,
behind
please.
mediation is that our perceptions of reality are influenced by media, and that this is that media and our human perception coexist, come together, and collectively create an understanding. And so this is to say that we have our sense of our real lived experience of things is determined through our interactions with media. So if that's media, remediation is looking at the influence that, and I'll say, I'm going to try and do this quickly. Correct me if you think this is wrong. Remediation is the effect of old generations of media on newly developed generations of media. So this is the idea that
Yeah.
what is new is in fact an evolutionary update from something that exists prior. So we talked earlier about maybe the record becomes the cassette tape, becomes the CD, becomes streaming. Every quote unquote new technology is an evolution of something that exists prior. So the new isn't really the new. It's the next step in the dominant.
So no, can I go ahead
Yeah.
and let me just build on what you said because I thought that was great. So I'm just going to build on what you're saying. So first, what I agree, and I think it's very helpful to think of remediation, like broadly, if we want to define it, remediation is the recognition that old and new media are present in the moment, always working together and working on each other. And that's in a very helpful way. In the sentence you just read, in that last part of the sentence, they kind of give you that idea. Because I'm just going to reread the last part of the sentence that you just read, Michael. Uh, after because I think they offer a sort of bare bones definition of their term remediation in that last part of the sentence.
Mm-hmm.
So, um, in order to get in a position to appreciate remediation, quote, we need to discern, quote, the rapid development of new digital media and the nearly as rapid response by traditional media. So, unquote. So, note here, they are not saying that to understand remediation, we have to focus on new digital media. They are saying that, but they're saying just as important as focusing on what the new digital media is doing to remake the media landscape. To think in a remediation mode, you have to be aware, you have to be cognizant of the fact that new digital media is rapidly developing and old media is developing just as rapidly in response to the new media. It's a feedback loop.
So I have a question for you about this. This is essentially to say, look, you can't appreciate new media without the context that is provided by older
Exactly. It's
media.
contextual. It's so, in other words, that is it. That's the key word. I would use, you could also, I think, use the philosophical term dialectical, but let's
Yeah,
use context. Let's
yeah.
just use context because that's really the key word here. To understand old to understand old media, you have to realize old media gets its meaning from the context of new media and
And I
vice versa.
and I think I think context is a better term than dialectical here because context implies a certain use case. And oftentimes, what is
Indeed.
new about
Indeed.
the new
Indeed.
is that it
Indeed.
expands or alters a use
Indeed.
case. Now, I have a
Indeed.
question for you about this, though.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
so, in the last decade of the 20th century, we're in an unusual position to appreciate remediation because of the rapid development of new digital media and the nearly as rapid response by traditional media. Good.
Mhm.
We're done with that. Older electronic, finished with it. Older
We're done.
electronic, older electronic and print media are seeking to reaffirm their status within our culture as digital media challenge that
Yeah,
status.
that's a great statement of that conflict, right? Or
Yes.
that co-presence. Yeah.
So,
Okay.
but
Well,
I
what does it
want
say?
you to explain that to me for a second
I have a great
because
example of it.
I want that because I think it's crystal clear how new digital media challenge established dominant media, right? So we understand how the iPhone revolutionized the cellular phone, but I think it's less clear how older media are seeking to reaffirm their status.
Well, I too, we have a mind meld, a Vulcan mind meld moment here because I asked myself precisely that question in regard to this particular sentence. And I came up with an example that pleases me. Uh, let's see if it pleases you and our listeners. I want to say in advance, though, that if you find my explanation or my example satisfying, I think a corollary or another conclusion that is inescapable from that premise of my example is this, that the older media response to the pushing or the development of newer media is always weaker. But let me use my example. So, but I just gave you a corollary that you could conclude from my example, and I didn't tell you my example. But here's the example I thought of, and I thought of a musical example. I know you're shocked, but I thought of a musical example. I'm thinking of the quote unquote resurgence of vinyl. Now, I put quote unquote, I'm already sort of going to my corollary, quote unquote resurgence of vinyl. Now, streaming is still king. All these people like me who buy vinyl, we're still streaming, right? So, but quote unquote, there has been a resurgence of vinyl largely because of because of a few content providers, mainly Taylor Swift.
Mhm.
But also there's been a rebirth, and one could say it's a resurgence, certainly in prominence. If you go to record stores or vinyl shops, and they still remain, you will see that the album has changed. And the album has changed. So even though they're reprinting and republishing in an old format, the packaging, the marketing, the very concept of the album has been totally redone by the awareness. It's filtering the awareness. totally the product. So when I go to the album, if I buy a Taylor Swift album now, and I'll keep on with Taylor, if I go to a record store and I buy a Taylor Swift album, that album is not the same as buying an album in 1960, 70, 80, 90, or any other time previous. What's changed? That new album that you're buying from Taylor was made, produced, and is being consumed with the awareness that the new media has swallowed the older media. So what do you do in response? So this is why I said, you may say this is too weak a response, but I think it is a response. What does Taylor do to make her albums different? Oftentimes, and this is true across a lot of different content providers, a lot of different musicians. There's the extra track that's on
Yep.
the vinyl.
Yep. The
There is
artwork.
the colored vinyl. There is the artwork. Now, I'm offering that as a modest example of how older media that would never have happened if the older media wasn't challenged by the new media. Now, it's not a great example because you could say, well, artwork, what the hell? And you know what? You're paying for that difference.
But I
You are
think
paying for it.
I think this
So,
works. I
yeah,
think this works. And so let me unpack this for a second and we'll move
sure.
on. You say older media has a response, but it's always weaker than the new
Maybe.
media.
Yeah, maybe.
It
But
is
my example
it
seems
is it is only going to be weaker if the new media succeeds. If the new media doesn't
maybe.
succeed, then the old media maintains its position. So this is just a case of who comes out on top, right?
Indeed.
So that's fine. I think what's interesting is that, and we've talked about this before in other sort of iterations of this idea, but this idea then that the older media is displaced by something new, and then it takes on sort of this hipster niche quality
Indeed.
about it.
It
But
becomes
it
artisanal. It becomes
becomes a
like an
part, well,
artisanal
it
product. Yeah.
becomes a part of the residual, to use
Indeed.
Williams's terms
Indeed.
again,
Indeed.
that can then be co-opted as an alternate version of cool. But the problem is,
Hmm.
because this new media that
You're
has
talking
this,
like a postmodernist. I'm getting kind of scared here.
well, because this whole, don't do that to me.
Yeah, I do. Yeah,
Because
go on.
this
Please, Jim.
new media changes the rules. These
Yes,
are these are expectations now that any community has to live with, which
indeed.
requires the update. It requires the new track. It requires the
Indeed,
artwork.
indeed.
So what you do, and I think this is a good example. I don't think this example is any different than saying, hey, older artistic styles
Hmm.
are going to, so I don't know how this just popped into my head. Maybe this works, maybe it doesn't, but I'm thinking about furniture. Okay. So you can get sort of, furniture, modern furniture styled from the 40s or the 50s. But what's it going to have? It's going to have a cup holder. It's going to have a
I
USB
think it's some,
connection, right? So
yeah.
you're going to have this sort of desire to go back to be different because there's always going to be a resistance,
I love it.
but that the imposition of the new is going to change the rules for what's going to work because we don't want to. The new didn't become the new. The emergent doesn't become the dominant because it offers us less. It has to offer us something new, which the old must respond to.
I like it.
I
I
like
don't
that
think
too.
I have anything to add to that. I think you're ready for the next sentence
I
because
think so. I mean, the only,
that has the two other terms that we want
right.
to gloss.
So, because we're talking in sentences, not paragraphs, we're going to say, again, it started out in the last decade of the 20th century. We're in an unusual position to appreciate remediation because of the rapid development of new digital media and the nearly as rapid response by traditional media. We've done that. Older electronic and print media, and apparently the furniture industry, are seeking to reaffirm their status
Clearly.
within our culture as digital media challenge that status. And we've talked about that. That's the emergent pushing in on the dominant. Both new and old media are invoking the twin logics of immediacy and hypermediacy in their efforts to remake themselves and each other. So what this last sentence does, both new and old are invoking the twin logics of immediacy and hypermediacy in their efforts to remake themselves and each other. So now what we're talking about is sort of what is that push that is going to enable any of these technologies to stick, that's going to allow them to organize themselves, if you will. And so I think we need to talk about hypermediacy and immediacy here.
That's an interesting idea, Michael. And I'm going to turn to the sentence that you just read and try to give a brief definition of both of these very interesting concepts, immediacy and hypermediacy. And I'll open it up for your response and
Right.
correction and amendment. Okay. So reading your sentence, the sentence you previously read, both new and old media are invoking the twin logics of immediacy and hypermediacy. Now, I'm going to explain these terms. I'm going to try to explain these terms by invoking some of the ideas or some of the larger argument, unpacking some of the larger argument in the introduction, but also in chapter 1 of remediation, which we'll be discussing in the episode. So one of the most, and this is especially the theme of the next chapter of remediation, the first sort of body chapter, the theoretical conceptual chapter, where they draw on a lot of literary theory and postmodern theorists. But anyway, there is this argument. So immediacy stands for, that term is part of a larger argument that Bolter and Grusin is making. That it's an argument about both art and media. And it goes something like this. Especially in the first chapter, we'll be talking about this more in the first episode. We'll be talking about this more in the first episode about this example of painting, but I'll just briefly touch on it here. In painting, they note that ever since Barry Falk's potted art history class, ever since the early modern era in the West, painters have been employing techniques of perspective to create a 3D image, 3D perspective that would produce a 3D image. A three-dimensional relation to space is closer to our normal everyday perception of reality, right?
It's more realistic.
It's more realistic, and I was avoiding the loaded term until the very end, but
I
that's a
can't
term.
avoid it.
But that's what it's about. Is
Right.
that so? Their larger argument is that every art form, that painting is not unique in this, that painting is a media form. And we've talked about painting in relation to media when we talked about Andre Bazin and Susan Sontag in earlier episodes. But what happened in painting in the West is not different from what happens in any media. Media gains and in fact, this principle seems to be even more apparent with the advent of digital media. And it really is kind of prompting their book. But digital media definitely makes the promises. Virtual reality, which was still kind of a newish thing when Bolter and Grusin are writing. That's their first topic of their book. They mention Strange Days, a movie about what we would now think is a very dated example of virtual reality, right? But they begin with that. That's the most contemporary issue for them. What's the point? Virtual reality is all about getting rid of mediation through using mediation in order to get rid of mediation. And that's kind of what was happening in this early pivotal moment in early modern history with painting. Painters were creating mediation acts that allowed you to mediate reality, but process reality in a way that you are hopefully, the idea would be, it's so realistic you forget you're looking at a painting. So that promise has always been there in media. But here's the thing, Michael, and like I said, we'll be talking about this in greater depth and nuance when we talk about the first chapter. But here's the thing about immediacy. Every media form, without exception, certainly digital media is no exception, it all promises to get rid of the technology and offer you the real thing. as opposed to a mediated experience. But guess what? Media is just media.
Right.
Eventually,
So
well,
just
but I think I have to finish
yeah, go
the.
ahead, go ahead, go ahead.
I just want to finish this. I want to tie in because I think this is important. I want to tie in the hypermediacy idea to the immediacy thing. So, because I think these two things, they define them together. So, all media promises immediacy, the experience of immediacy, of getting rid of technology so you can experience the thing directly. But guess what? It's a promise, but it can never be fulfilled. So, what do you have? What have you always had? Remediation has always been with us because what you've always had is a newer technology, or what seems like we've always had. You have developments within an art form, develops within a media that promises to discard the media apparatus. It never happens. So what you get is voila, hypermediacy, which is a jumbo of different kind of media forms.
Mhm.
And so the hyper-mediated, the fact that every new media development doesn't get rid of media, it just adds another media component to our crowded, media-rich environment. One way, final way to define hypermediacy is they use the term media-rich. Bolter and Grusin use the term media-rich to describe the hyper-media environment in which we live. Okay, I'll stop.
There's a couple distinctions here though that I think are important. Hypermediacy is so we talked at the very beginning of this discussion, we talked about mediation and remediation. And the key aspect of remediation was that we are co-authoring our understanding of reality along with these media influences, right?
Indeed.
That our understandings of the world are not fully determined by the media, but they are influenced by the media, that we have a co-authoring of this. One of the things that's interesting to me about this idea of hypermediacy
Mhm.
is that we are called into that we have an awareness of this like we're a part of it again,
Mhm.
whereas something like, okay, let me see, I'm trying to think about how to explain this. To me, the idea of immediacy is every new technological evolution
Mhm.
seeks to try and sort of erase itself or
Erase itself.
minimalize.
Absolutely. That's a beautiful
And
way of putting
so
it.
I
Right.
think about like the thing as you were talking, the thing that immediately popped up to me was the Apple Watch. And
Uh-huh.
what was the genius behind this watch? Well, it was going to let you forget your phone,
Right.
right? So, yes, you can have a watch now, which is a smaller thing than your phone. So, yes, you're still reliant on a new technology, but it hides the old one from you. You don't have to be tethered to
Absolutely.
it,
That's a
right?
brilliant
So,
example. Yeah.
the idea here is that it's sort of the shell game in a way, like we're hiding something, right? And the better the technology gets, the more it hides itself, the
Mhm.
less
Mhm.
apparent it is. Whereas with hypermediacy, it seems to me that because we're layering multiple technologies, multiple medias into a single experience,
Mhm.
that we become aware of the medium more, that we're more, and it's almost as if with jumping around with terms, so I apologize if this is confusing. But the idea with remediation is that we're a part of this understanding,
Indeed.
but it's not really necessarily on a conscious level.
Mhm.
We just have a mutual influence with our media. Our
Mhm.
media and our own perceptions are mutually
Mhm.
impactful here. Whereas with hypermediacy, that's the case, but what differentiates hypermediacy from remediation is that we're conscious of this.
Mhm.
We're more aware of the impact that our medias have on us. We're
Mhm.
more aware of the impact of the layering of these medias.
Mhm.
And so it's a more active engagement.
Mhm.
Um,
You know,
it's not
Michael.
passive. It's
Yeah.
an
Yeah.
active engagement.
Yeah.
So
Right.
when you play like the example that came to mind about this, right,
Okay.
is a video game,
Mhm.
right? You have so many different layers of engagement.
Hmm.
You're aware that what's happening, even with something as immersive as like VR, where you're actually
Yeah,
physically engaged in these
yeah,
games,
yeah.
you're still aware of the fact that your feet are in your living room or your butt's on your couch or you're in whatever space you're in. You're never fully removed from your your physical realities.
Mhm.
And I think that that's very different than remediation, where we
Yeah.
sort of have to step back and say, well, sure, you understand politics in this way, but it has to do with your engagement with these media forms. Or yes, you have your self-concept is X, but it's also influenced by these media influences.
Mhm.
That's much more subtle and in some ways kind of potentially insidious. Whereas I think that hypermediacy has an interesting promise of like, well, no, I'm a part of this. And I think that we're still subject to remediation with hypermediacy. I mean, there's still that doesn't go away,
Mhm.
but we're more active in hypermediacy. Yeah.
I, I don't know. I think this is an issue this is a great issue that we should revisit. I think we'll end up revisiting in the first chapter because in this chapter, at least, I'm seeing them doing more, you're kind of enacting and translating the terms.
Hmm.
I, in this chapter, I don't see them doing the kind of work you're doing. So, for example,
No,
when
I'm
you
not.
talk about, oh, go ahead.
I'm
I'm
sorry,
sorry.
sorry. I'm not saying this is their argument necessarily. I'm saying
Oh,
that
yeah, you
as I'm
right.
understanding
Yeah,
this to sort
yeah,
of tease this out a bit,
yeah, yeah.
and certainly we'll get to this when we get into the next chapter.
Hmm.
But I guess what I'm trying to do is to not just, explain these terms and sort of unpack them,
Hmm.
but there's an interesting tension between hypermediacy and the idea of remediation.
Well, I guess the only place where I'm taking issue with you is, and it's not, I don't even know if it's really, if taking issue defines it, but uh, I'm seeing both remediation and hypermediation as descriptions with almost no subjective component. Like to me, when they say remediation, and the passage we glossed, right?
Hmm.
Um, I think they just want us to be aware of the ways in which the old and the new push on each other. And um, I think they're saying, well, this is what I mean by descriptions rather than maybe theorizing or conceptualizations. I think that they're not I don't think they're arguing that we are aware when we interact with our environments. Now, your example of the virtual reality headset might contradict what I'm saying, or rather my argument might not stand against your
I
example of the
think you're right for
thing.
remediation. I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah. But
I
for
don't.
hypermediation, I'm thinking still they're just doing a descriptive. Well, let me use your headset example, just to clarify what I'm trying to say. But like maybe I don't know, maybe I don't have an argument at all. It wouldn't be the first time. The I still think they're in a descriptive mode when they describe hypermediacy. They're just basically saying, guess what? Everybody's promising to get rid of the old, that it doesn't work. So what they do is they create the web, and the web they use the example of the old CNN website, which is
Right.
hyper crowded with all these links to various medias, right? And so they're saying, well, really, what the promise of immediacy does, what the new does to the old, is increase our media, it increases the objects in the media landscape. Now, where you went to from that is saying that not only do we have a crowded media landscape, we're more aware that the media landscape is crowded. And I guess my reservation is I still think you could be a McLuhan-esque subject, unaware. I'm thinking of the audience, the TV audience that McLuhan was talking about. Like, he's talking about the ways in which television is enabling a global consciousness, but he doesn't think his readers are quite aware that that's happening. And I think that's kind of what's going on with hypermediacy.
I think that's right to a point.
Okay, but I'm interested in your example of the
I
of the
think I
headset
think
goes
if
against
you're
what I'm saying, right?
I think if you're born into that environment,
Uh-huh.
then that's fine.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that when you start, I guess my response is my understanding of hypermediacy,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and I'm not trying. I think that the discussion, invoking McLuhan here is really helpful. Okay. But if you look at this as you have sort of a status quo of whatever our media environment is,
Mm-hmm.
okay,
Mm-hmm.
when you add a media layer to that,
Mm-hmm.
that can't go unnoticed.
Mm-hmm.
And then you add another media layer to that. So
And
as new media develops, right, and these media become more complex, we will notice those. We are encouraged to notice those because this is what drives the term
no, I
new.
like it. I like it.
Okay.
I like it.
And I think that awareness, all I'm saying is, I think that awareness,
Mm-hmm.
which is different than with remediation. With remediation, we sort of exist in
Yeah,
that,
we exist in it.
right?
Yeah, right.
But as these new media become more complex, we are aware of the additions and we become more, I think, what's the word I want to use here?
Well, reflexive, it sounds like what you're describing. More reflective, more
More, well, also
aware,
more,
self-aware, self-conscious.
yeah, more, like, oh my God, for someone who talks as much as I do, this is a problem. I can't find my words. We're more involved in our
Interactive.
negotiations. And yes,
Interactive. Yeah, no, that I like it. I like it. So you're adding this is a good place to stop
I
because
think so.
we can see whether or not this idea. No, I get what you're doing now. I think we reached, here's something that this discussion clarified for me. I think I very much agree with you that their basic root term, core term of remediation, it's descriptive. And as I understand your argument, the the hypermedia reality
Hmm.
necessarily. So again, your argument, as I understand it, and I take your point, that hypermediacy as a media environment has it necessarily entails a kind of ratcheting up or enhancement of consciousness, awareness,
Yes.
or interactivity, which is an interesting development. We'll see if they extrapolate on that in
I
their
want
first.
I want to say one last thing that's not
Sure,
necessarily part of this terminological discussion we've had.
sure.
What's really fascinating about this, and you saw this, Kember and Zelinska had this discussion when they were talking about sort of the struggle within cultural studies of whether to go with McLuhan or whether to go with Williams.
That's right.
What's fascinating about this whole discussion we've had today
Mhm.
is you can see how those two perspectives can utilize each other, right? Talking about Williams as a way of explaining the evolution of media and invoking
Oh,
McLuhan
that's a
to t-
great point.
to talk about
Yeah.
how we can explain how this evolution is happening.
That's a
It's
great point. That's a great
isn't that
point.
interesting? I mean, it's interesting. It just occurred to me as we're talking about this. I'm like, wow, you get both of those perspectives layer so neatly at this moment. And
No, that's
then
so true.
to Ken Brunzelinski's
Great point.
point, well, how do we want to talk about this? Do we want to talk about this in terms of, theory, in which case we go with McLuhan, or do we want to talk about this in terms of like capitalism and evolution, in which case we go with Williams?
No, that's a brilliant point. Let's end with this. I'm going to try to restate it and be pithy about it and stop me if I don't get pithy, but it's such a good point. I don't mind saying it again. Not in my terms. I'm trying to
Yeah, yeah.
recapitulate your terms. Uh, Working with your idea. At the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s, at a particular moment in cultural studies and communication studies, Williams was the antagonist to McLuhan. what you are suggesting, it needed to have been so, right?
Mm-hmm.
There were, McLuhan could have, I'm sorry, Williams could have absorbed
Yes.
more of the technological, phenomenological side from McLuhan, or McLuhan could have embraced. It's possible to imagine a synthesis of these supposed impossible antagonists,
It is, which is
right?
cool.
It's
Like
possible to imagine that.
I have a grin on my face right now. I feel like that's just the kind of a cool observation.
It is.
Barry,
It is. All right.
this
Thank you, sir.
this was a lot of fun today. We'll pick this up next time.
All right, sir. Take care.
Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Critical Media Studies podcast. To find out more about the show, check out our webpage at criticalmediastudiespodcast.com.